Digital.
And welcome to Mental Health 101. Now, Mental Health 101 is created to empower our mental health awareness. Another week, another great episode. When digital Babylon meets ancient wisdom, a Christian response in or to the liberal girls' mental health crisis.
This episode is a reaction to the original article by Jonathan Haidt. We're living through what social psychologist Haidt calls it the largest epidemic of adolescent mental illness ever recorded. But here's what's particularly striking. It's not hitting all young people equally. Liberal teenage girls are experiencing depression and anxiety at unprecedented rates. Over 50% report mental health diagnoses compared to roughly 20% of conservative girls.
Indeed, so Mr. Meg, that a striking connection between ancient wisdom and the modern crisis. But let's start with the data itself. What exactly did Haid discover about liberal girls specifically?
This wasn't always the case. Prior to 2012, there were virtually no differences between liberal and conservative girls and mental health outcomes. Something specific happened around that time, the year smartphone adoption reached critical mass and platforms like Instagram and Tumblr exploded in popularity. Hate's diagnosis points directly towards principles that early Christian communities understood intimately. The reverse CBT he describes, where young people are systematically taught cognitive distortions rather than resilience, stands in stark contrast to the identity formation practices we see in the New Testament church. We're witnessing the predictable results of a generation taught to build identity on social media validation rather than divine truth. The discovery itself reads like something out of a psychological thriller. In 2020, graduate student Zach Goldberg was analyzing Pew Research data when he noticed that white liberals were far more likely to report mental health diagnoses than conservatives. But when Haidt asked him to break it down by gender and age, the real pattern emerged. Young liberal women weren't just slightly more depressed than their conservative counterparts, they were in a different category entirely. We're talking about a majority of young liberal women reporting mental health diagnoses compared to roughly 20% of young conservative women. That's not a gap, that's a chasm. But here's what's make this particularly relevant to a Christian understanding of identity and community. This wasn't always the case. Before 2012, there were virtually no differences between liberal and conservative girls in terms of mental health outcomes. Something specific happened around that time that sent liberal girls on a dramatically different psychobiological trajectory. Haidt identifies 2012 as the inflection point, the year smartphone adoption reached critical mass among teenagers, the year Instagram exploded in popularity, and the year Tumblr became the primary gathering place for a new kind of identity based activism. This timing isn't coincidental. What we're seeing is the real world application of what the early church fathers would have recognized as false gospels, systems of belief that promise identity, meaning, and belonging, but ultimately deliver anxiety, fragmentation, and despair. The Apostle Paul warned about this exact dynamic in his letters to the Galatians and Colossians, where he confronted communities that had begun building their identity on external markers rather than their status as children of God. The Monitoring the Future data shows that beginning in 2012, liberal girls began reporting dramatically higher rates of what psychologists call self derogation, agreement with statements like, I feel I can't do anything right, and sometimes I think I am no good at all. Conservative girls showed no such increase, neither did boys of any political persuasion. This suggests that we're not just looking at a general mental health crisis, but something specifically toxic about the messages and communities that liberal girls are encountering online. They're being systemically taught to see themselves as powerless victims in a world of oppressive forces, what Haidt calls external locus of control. But early Christian communities understood something profound about identity formation. When you ground your sense of self in divine love rather than social approval, you develop what Paul calls the peace that passes understanding and what modern psychology recognizes as resilience. In conclusion, the data reveals that liberal girls aren't just struggling with normal adolescent challenges, They're being systematically taught cognitive and spiritual patterns that early Christians would have recognized as pathways to despair rather than flourishing.
So you're saying this is not just about the girls being more sensitive or political stress. There's something specifically toxic about the online environments liberal girls are entering. What exactly are they encountering there, Mr. Mag?
Hate it traces much of the current crisis back to Tumblr, a social media platform that peaked around 2014, but whose cultural influence has been vastly underestimated. Unlike Facebook, which connected people through existing social networks, Tumblr brought together strangers who shared obsessions, particularly around gender identity, sexuality, and political activism. The platform encouraged boutique identity construction, where young people crafted increasingly specific identity categories, then defended these identities with enraged reactions to perceived disrespect. From a biblical perspective, this represents a fundamental inversion of how identity works. Scripture teaches that our primary identity comes from being created in the image of God and adopted as his children. This identity is given, not constructed. It's secure, not fragile. But Tumblr culture taught the opposite. Young people learned to build elaborate identity constructions built on perceived marginalization, trauma, and oppression. They were taught that feelings were infallible guides to truth, that words could literally harm them, and that the world was divided into oppressors and victims. The early church fathers would have recognized this as vainglory, deriving identity from human approval rather than divine love. The platform's algorithm rewarded extreme expressions of victimhood with attention and validation. In conclusion, Tumblr created a digital environment that systemically taught young liberal girls to embrace exactly the cognitive patterns that both ancient wisdom and modern psychology identify as pathways to mental illness.
That's powerful analysis of how online platforms can be reshape identity information, Mr. Meg. But let's dig deeper into a psychological mechanisms. How exactly does social media create what you are calling this external locus of control?
The traditional child development involves graduated risk taking, children gradually learning to navigate challenges and build confidence in their agency. But smartphone based childhood replaces this with curated helplessness. Jean Twenge's research reveals liberal girls spend more time on social media than any other group. 31% report using 5 or more hours daily. They're spending less time in face to face friendships and learning to navigate real world challenges. Social media algorithms reward the most extreme expressions of victimhood with attention and validation. Young girls learn that elaborate trauma narratives and intense emotional reactions brought support from online communities. This creates learned helplessness, the belief that outcomes are determined by forces beyond your control. The early church fathers would have understood this as spiritual bondage, where people become enslaved to external approval rather than finding freedom in divine acceptance. The contrast with biblical approaches is striking. Scripture teaches we are more than conquerors through him who loved us, and I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. These aren't platitudes, they're therapeutic interventions that help develop resilience and self efficacy. In conclusion, social media creates psychological training that systemically undermines the sense of agency that both ancient wisdom and modern psychology identify as essential for mental health.
This idea of a curated helplessness is chilling, but you've mentioned early Christian communities several times as offering an alternative model. How specifically did this those communities approach identity formation and mental health, Mr. Mike?
The early Christian approach to identity formation represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated system ever developed for human flourishing, where modern social media teaches young people that identity must be constructed, defended, and validated through external approval. The early church taught that identity is received as a gift from God and then lived out in community. Paul's letters provide what amounts to a complete manual for healthy psychological development. In Ephesians, he tells believers they were chosen before the foundation of the world and adopted as sons through Jesus Christ. This isn't a theological abstraction, it's a therapeutic intervention. Young people who truly grasp that their worth is established by divine decree rather than human approval are freed from the exhausting work of constantly proving themselves. The early church practiced what we might call identity confirmation rather than identity construction. Baptism wasn't just a religious ritual, it was a public declaration that someone's fundamental identity had shifted from being defined by their past, their performance, or their social status to being defined by their relationship with God. They were literally clothed with Christ, as Paul puts it in Galatians. The contrast with social media culture is stark, where platforms like Instagram and TikTok encourage young people to construct elaborate public personas based on their uniqueness and authenticity. Early Christian communities emphasized what they called putting off the old self and putting on the new self. This wasn't about suppressing individuality, it was about finding your truest self through connection with divine love. The therapeutic implications are profound. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy tries to help people identify and challenge distorted thinking patterns, but the early church went deeper. They provided an entirely different foundation for self understanding that made many of these distortions simply irrelevant. Consider the great untruths that Haidt identifies as driving the current mental health crisis among liberal girls. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Always trust your feelings, and life is a battle between good people and evil people. Each of these represents a fundamental misunderstanding about human nature and flourishing that early Christian teaching directly addresses. Instead of what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, early Christians taught what Paul expresses in Romans: we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Instead of always trust your feelings, they taught that feelings are important but should be submitted to truth and wisdom. Instead of dividing the world into good and evil people, they taught that all people are both fallen and image bearers, both sinful and beloved. The community practices were equally important. Early Christian gatherings included what they called one another commands. Believers were to encourage one another, bear one another's burdens, and to speak truth in love to one another. This created environments where young people could practice healthy vulnerability without the performative aspects of social media. Perhaps most importantly, early churches provided what psychologists now call generative opportunities, chances for young people to contribute meaningfully to something larger than themselves. Instead of being consumers of content or validators of each other's identities, they were active participants in the work of loving their neighbors, caring for the poor, and building communities of healing and hope. In conclusion, early Christian communities understood that healthy identity formation requires divine foundation, community confirmation, and meaningful service, exactly the elements that social media culture systemically undermines.
This vision of identity as received rather than constructed is compelling, but let's get practical. If you were advising parents or church leaders who are dealing with young liberal girls caught in this mental health crisis, what specific steps would you recommend, Mr. Meg?
The first step is recognizing that we're not just dealing with individual mental health issues, we're confronting what amounts to systemic discipleship and destructive ways of thinking and being. The platforms and communities these young women are engaging with are actively teaching them cognitive distortions, emotional fragility, and an external locus of control. Any effective response must provide equally systemic counterformation. Christians need to become much more intentional about what I call identity discipleship, explicitly teaching young people how to ground their sense of self in divine love rather than social validation. This isn't just Sunday school curriculum, it's a therapeutic intervention disguised as spiritual formation. Practically, this means creating regular opportunities for young people to hear their identity spoken over them by trusted adults. Early Christian baptismal practices provide a model. The community would publicly declare the new believer's identity as a beloved child of God, forgiven, accepted, and called to meaningful purpose. We need modern equivalents, perhaps monthly identity affirmation gatherings where young people hear specific truths about their worth, calling, and potential. The early church also understood the power of counter narrative. Instead of allowing people to be defined by their worst moments, failures, or victimization, they taught what theologians call redemptive storytelling, learning to see your life as a story of divine love working through both triumph and suffering towards ultimate good. Young liberal girls who've been taught to see themselves primarily as victims of oppressive systems need to learn alternative narratives where they're protagonists in stories of healing, growth, and service. Churches also need to provide what I call graduated agency opportunities, structured ways for young people to experience their own effectiveness in making positive change. Instead of the learned helplessness that social media promotes, we need to create environments where young people can see direct connections between their choices and meaningful outcomes. This might mean youth ministry programs focused on local service projects where teenagers can see tangible results from their efforts. It could involve mentorship programs where slightly older young women teach younger ones specific skills: cooking, music, writing, art, creating chains of empowerment rather than cycles of victimization. The digital aspect requires particular attention. Haight's recommendation for raising the age of internet adulthood from 13 to 16 or 18 is crucial, but churches can do more. We need to create alternative digital communities that provide the connection and identity exploration young people are seeking without the toxic dynamics of mainstream social media. Early Christian communities also understood the importance of intergenerational relationships. Social media culture tends to segregate young people with their peers, creating echo chambers of immature thinking and mutual reinforcement of destructive patterns. But healthy communities integrate people of different ages, allowing young people to benefit from the wisdom and stability of older generations while contributing their energy and idealism. Churches need to be much more intentional about creating these intergenerational relationships. This might mean pairing every teenager with an adult mentor, or creating mixed age small groups, or designing service projects that require people of different generations to work together towards common goals. Theological training is equally important. Young liberal girls who've been taught to see the world through the lens of oppressor victim dynamics need to learn more sophisticated ways of understanding suffering, injustice, and social change. The biblical tradition offers incredibly rich resources for thinking about systemic problems without falling into the despair and powerlessness that characterize much contemporary activism. This means teaching about concepts like common grace, the already but not yet nature of God's kingdom, and the ways divine love works through imperfect people and institutions to bring about gradual but real change. Young people need to understand that working for justice doesn't require seeing yourself as powerless or seeing others as completely evil. Perhaps most importantly, churches need to provide what early Christians community called Sabbath rest, regular breaks from the anxiety and performance pressure of contemporary culture. This isn't just about turning off phones for an hour on Sunday morning. It's about creating extended periods where young people can experience what life feels like when they're not constantly seeking validation, consuming content, or managing their online persona. In conclusion, healing the mental health crisis among liberal girls requires nothing less than systemic counterformation, creating communities and practices that teach healthy identity formation, genuine empowerment, and sustainable hope as alternatives to the toxic discipleship of social media culture.
Mr. Meg, that's powerful analysis. How online platforms can reshape identity formation. But let's dig deeper into a psychological mechanism. What exactly does social media create what you are calling external locus of control?
Yes, that's a really good question because what we have to do in this case is really first step is recognizing that we're not dealing just with mental health issues. We're confronting what amounts to systemic discipleship and destructive ways of thinking and being. The platforms and communities these young women are engaging with are actively teaching them cognitive distortions, emotional fragility, and external locus of control. Any effective response must provide equally systemic counterformation. Practically, this means creating regular opportunities to hear identity spoken to them over and by trusted adults. The early church understood the power of counter narrative. Instead of allowing people to be found and defined by their worst moments, they will see the redemptive storytelling, things that will really see a story of divine love working through all the bad things in life. This might mean youth ministry programs totally changing around, and this disciples now need particular attention. Churches need to be much more intentional about creating these type of opportunities for children, especially these liberal girls. Perhaps most importantly, churches need to provide an outlet, a place where these people can go. In conclusion, the healing this crisis among young girls and liberal girls means creating counterformation, sustainable alternative to toxic discipleship.
The idea of curated helplessness is chilling, but you mentioned early Christian communities several times as offering alternative model. How specifically those communities approach identity formation and mental health?
In this case, what we have to do is to try to respond to the critics who might say we're dismissing local and legitimate social justice concerns or trying to use religion to solve political problems. This concern reveals one of the most destructive aspects of our contemporary moment, the assumption that everything must be viewed through partisan lenses. The mental health crisis among young liberal girls isn't ultimately a political problem, it's a human problem requiring human wisdom. The data should concern everyone, regardless of political affiliation. When over 50% of young women in any demographic report mental health diagnosis, when suicide attempts among teenagers are at historic highs, these aren't liberal or conservative issues, they're humanitarian crisis. The early Christian approach doesn't dismiss social justice concerns, it provides a more sustainable foundation for addressing them. Young women passionate about inequality and systemic injustice are responding to real problems, but current approaches to activism may be creating more harm than healing. The biblical tradition offers prophetic realism, clear recognition of human sin and structural injustice combined with ultimate hope grounded in divine love. This is neither naive optimism that ignores problems nor cynical despair that sees only oppression. This provides a more psychologically healthy foundation for social activism than victor oppressor narratives. Young people can work passionately for justice without seeing themselves as powerless victims or opponents of irredeemable evil. The early church understood that sustainable activism must flow from spiritual fullness rather than emotional emptiness. People trying to heal their own wounds through political activity often become trauma activists whose passion is really therapy for their own pain, creating volatile, unsustainable activism. But activism flowing from spiritual grounding can be maintained over decades rather than burning out quickly. People who know they're beloved children of God can work for justice without needing to win every battle to maintain their worth. Churches have resources secular institutions lack, transcendent sources of meaning, intergenerational communities, practices of confession and forgiveness, and wisdom traditions tested over centuries. The ultimate goal isn't to make young liberal girls more conservative or religious, it's to help them become more fully human, genuinely empowered, and sustainably hopeful as they work to make the world more just and beautiful. In conclusion, addressing the mental health crisis requires moving beyond political categories to focus on human flourishing, drawing on ancient wisdom that offers healing resources transcending contemporary cultural divisions.
Mr. Meg, these practical steps are helpful, but I'm wondering about something deeper. How do we address the underlying spiritual hunger that seems to be driving young people forward these destructive online communities in the first place?
This is perhaps the most crucial insight for understanding the current crisis. Young liberal girls aren't flocking to toxic online communities because they're fundamentally different from other teenagers. They're responding to the same spiritual hunger that every generation experiences, but they're trying to satisfy it through digital means that promise transcendence while delivering bondage. The identity construction culture of platforms like Tumblr and Instagram appeals to what theologians call the imago Dei, the image of God and humanity that craves significance, creativity, and authentic self expression. These aren't wrong desires, they're fundamental spiritual longings that point toward divine relationship. But when young people try to fulfill these longings through human approval and social media validation, they create what the biblical tradition calls broken cisterns, sources that promise living water but can't actually provide it. The early church fathers understood that spiritual hunger, when misdirected, becomes wrongful direction, disordered desire that increases with feeding rather than being satisfied. This is exactly what we see with social media addictions. Young people get temporary hits of validation from likes, shares, and comments, but each hit requires more to achieve the same effect, creating cycles of anxiety and compulsion. But here's what makes the current situation particularly tragic. The spiritual hunger driving these young women towards destructive online communities is actually a sign of spiritual health. They're seeking transcendence, meaning, community, and purpose, exactly what human beings were created to seek. The problem isn't the seeking, it's the objects of their search. Blaise Pascal's concept of the God shaped hole helps explain why identity politics and social media activism become so psychologically compelling for many liberal girls. These movements promise to fill fundamental human needs for belonging, significance, and moral purpose. They offer communities of people who share your values, causes that make you feel important, and narratives that give meaning to suffering and struggle. But because these movements ground identity in human approval rather than divine love, they create what psychologists call conditional self worth, a sense of value that depends on maintaining group approval and ideological purity. This makes adherents simultaneously grandiose and fragile, convinced of their moral superiority while being devastated by criticism or disagreement. The early church provided what we might call unconditional transcendence, connection to ultimate meaning and infinite love that didn't depend on personal performance or group approval. Young people who experience this kind of spiritual grounding develop what Paul calls the peace that surpasses understanding, a deep security that enabled them to meaningful work without being destroyed by setbacks or criticism. Contemporary research on what psychologists call intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation confirms the wisdom of this approach. People who find meaning through internal values like personal growth, relationships, and service tend to be happier and more resilient than those who depend on external validation like fame, wealth, or social approval. But the early church went even deeper, teaching that the most intrinsic motivation of all comes from knowing you're loved by the creator of the universe. The therapeutic implications are profound. Young liberal girls who've been taught to build their identity around their oppression, their trauma, or their political activism need to discover what might be called grounded transcendence, connection to something infinitely larger than themselves that simultaneously affirms their dignity and calls them to meaningful service. This doesn't mean dismissing their concerns about injustice or their desire for social change. Many of these young women are responding to real problems in the world, and their passion for justice reflects something beautiful about their character. But it means helping them understand that effective activism requires the kind of inner stability and resilience that only can come from spiritual grounding. The biblical tradition offers incredibly rich resources for thinking about social justice without falling into the despair and fragmentation that characterize much contemporary activism. Churches need to help young people understand that working for justice is actually a form of worship, participating in God's work of healing, ongoing, and redemption in the world. In conclusion, the spiritual hunger driving young liberal girls towards destructive online communities is actually a sign of their fundamental health and dignity as human beings created for a relationship with God, but it requires redirection towards sources of transcendence that can actually sustain them rather than destroying them.
Mr. Mick, how do we respond to critics who might say we are dismissing legitimate social justice concerns on trying to use religion to solve political problems?
This concern reveals one of the most destructive aspects of our contemporary moment, the assumption that everything must be viewed through partisan lenses. The data should concern everyone, regardless of political affiliation, when over half of young women in any demographic report mental health diagnosis, when suicide attempts are very high. The early Christian approach addresses all of these social justice concerns, but it provides a more sustainable foundation for addressing them. The biblical tradition offers prophetic realism, clear eyed recognition of human sin and structural injustice combined with ultimate hope grounded in divine love. This provides a more psychologically healthy foundation for social activism than victim oppressor narratives. The early church understood that sustainable activism must flow from spiritual fullness rather than emotional emptiness. But activism flowing from spiritual grounding can be maintained over decades rather than burning out quickly. Churches have resources secular institutions lack, because the ultimate goal isn't to make young liberal girls more conservative or religious, it's to help them become more fully human and sustainable, hopeful as they work to make the world more just and beautiful. In conclusion, addressing the mental health crisis requires moving beyond mere political categories to focus exactly on human flourishing and drawing on ancient wisdom.
Mr. Mick, that's a compelling vision of healing that transcend political divisions. As we wrap up, what would you say to parents, pastors, and educators who feel overwhelmed by the scope of this crisis but want to take a concrete action?
The scope of this crisis can indeed feel overwhelming, but that's exactly why we need to remember one of the most profound insights from early Christian spirituality. Transformation happens through small, consistent practices rather than dramatic interventions. The Desert Fathers called these practices little deaths, daily choices to turn away from destructive patterns and toward life giving ones. For parents, this might mean something as simple as instituting regular phone free family meals where you practice the lost art of face to face conversation. It could involve creating weekly identity affirmation moments where you speak specific truths about your child's character, gifts, and potential, not based on their performance or achievements, but on their fundamental dignity as beloved image bearers of God. The early church understood that identity formation happens through repetition and community reinforcement. Children who hear regularly that they are fearfully and wonderfully made, that they have unique gifts to contribute, and that their worth doesn't depend on social approval develop what psychologists call secure attachment and what Christians might call grounded identity. For pastors and church leaders, the opportunity is enormous, but requires courage and intentionality. Churches need to become much more explicit about providing alternatives to the toxic discipleship of social media culture. This means creating intergenerational communities where young people can experience genuine belonging without the performance pressure of online platforms. Consider implementing what I call Sabbath practices, regular times when your community unplugs from digital devices and experiences what life feels like when you're not constantly managing your online presence. The theological formation is equally crucial. Young people who've absorbed the victor oppressor narratives of contemporary activism need to learn more sophisticated ways of thinking about suffering, injustice, and social change. The biblical tradition offers those resources of the prophetic mission, most importantly for young people. The most important insight from early Christian psychology is that healing happens in relationship and through community service and practice rather than individual effort alone. Young people who are struggling with anxiety, depression, and an external locus of control need to experience alternative communities where they can practice different ways of thinking, feeling, and being. But here's what gives me the most hope. Every generation faces unique challenges, but human beings have remarkable capacities for resilience, growth, and transformation when they're supported by wise communities and grounded in transcendent sources of meaning and purpose. The data that hate presents is sobering, but it's also a call to action. We're not helpless observers of cultural decline. We're people with access to 2,000 years of tested wisdom about human flourishing, supported by communities that specialize in transformation and hope. The early church turned the Roman Empire upside down, not through political power or technological innovation, but through alternative communities that demonstrated different ways of being human. They showed that people could live with security instead of anxiety, hope instead of despair, and love instead of fear, even in the midst of challenging circumstances. We have the opportunity to do something for this generation, not by rejecting their concerns or dismissing their pain, but providing better answers to their deepest questions and more sustainable solutions to their most pressing needs. The mental health crisis among liberal girls is real, serious, and urgent, but it's also an invitation to rediscover ancient wisdom about identity, community, and human flourishing that could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities and perhaps even our broader culture. Most importantly, it requires us to remember that every young person struggling with anxiety and depression is created in the image of God, beloved beyond measure. and capable of transformation and flourishing when surrounded by the right communities and grounded in transcendent sources of meaning and purpose. The ancient church knew something we seem to have forgotten. The answer to human brokenness isn't more sophisticated technology or better political systems. It's communities of love that provide security, purpose, and hope to every person who enters them, especially the most vulnerable and wounded. That's the church we're called to be for this generation. That's the hope we have to offer. And that's the work that begins with each of us in our own families and communities, choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and ancient wisdom over contemporary delusion. In conclusion, the mental health crisis among liberal girls isn't a problem we have to solve. It's an invitation we get to accept to participate in the ancient and ongoing work of human healing and transformation that has been the church's calling from the very beginning.
Mr. Meg, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. Yes, people, when digital Babylon meets ancient wisdom, the growing emotional and spiritual turmoil facing young women in an age of constant connection yet deep disconnection. Now, Mr. Meg, would you like to plug in something?
Thanks for the opportunity. Write the book, grow the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn, GMIC, the Dr. Digital Smith, PhD. Also, listen to my podcast, the Dr. Digital Podcast, and pick up a couple volumes I have on Amazon, Burning America and On Track, Ian Hunter.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Meg, the Dr. Digital, and please do listen to our Music 101, Love Letters, and Sex 101. So, Mr. Meg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Till next time, Deus Volt.
Modicon people, see you soon.